Hello and welcome to Avos of Havo. This is probably going to be quite a short video. I didn't even know I really wanted to make it, but I have finished The Lord of the Rings and we should probably talk about that. So this year my intention was to try and read as many difficult books as I can and try to tick off those things that people would consider the final boss of literature. And I thought this one was going to be an easy one that I could finish in maybe a month or two and then move on to like the really hard stuff somewhere. But it took me a lot longer to finish this, and I think various things in my life led to that. It wasn't just the case that this book is hard, although it is a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. It is also just pacing and me not really liking to carry something this big with me around here and there, and also just forgetting what happens at various points in the novel and then having to go back and research things, and it just wasn't as smooth of a reading experience as it could have been. I am very curious to see how many people have read The Lord of the Rings or know of The Lord of the Rings, because I feel like when we talk about this book now, when we talk about the story, it's the movies that tends to be at the forefront of everyone's thought, and there's lots of people who could say that they love The Lord of the Rings and have never read the books because they're so familiar with the movies. The movies at this point are really the definitive way, I feel like, to experience this story, and then you read the books if you really want to, but they're very different in the eyes of culture. Like, I feel like the language that's been made by this book is so saturated in all of modernity, whether it is just our general understanding of fantasy, what fantasy looks like, but also specifically in the literary and the filmic languages of fantasy. It's just massively, massively influential, for better or for worse. And ultimately, I feel like what I gained from reading this is understanding where a lot of these tropes and ideas come from, and being able to say, oh, I see why a lot of fantasy is like this. Is because we're all really following the footsteps of Tolkien's world. We're still living in Tolkien's world. Yeah, it's fine. It's okay. But from here, when I get to the actual review side of things, I'm going to be very controversial and probably say that this book is somewhat overrated, to the point that if someone wanted to get into fantasy, this would, to me, neither be the best, nor the pinnacle, nor the most important book that I would recommend someone to read. I think that fantasy is ultimately a much more diverse genre, a genre of a lot more potential, and the gravitational pull that something as influential as The Lord of the Rings has in the genre limits our expectations for what the genre can really do. Anyways, this is probably going to be a hot take, so to speak. Okay, so to begin by reviewing The Lord of the Rings, this is a enormous fantasy novel. It's broken up to 3, but really only because of publishing standards and writing standards. You do have to read the whole thing. It's not a novel where you can read just Fellowship and enjoy it. Fellowship ends kind of on a cliffhanger, and then it goes straight into Two Towers. Two Towers, again, sort of ends on a cliffhanger, and it goes straight into Return of the King. It is one consistent narrative. It's better experienced without any gaps between any of the novels. So it's kind of moot for me to actually talk about the individual merits of each novel, whereas I think the aesthetic experience of The Lord of the Rings is to read the whole thing. So what is this whole thing? Plot-wise, it's the story of a bunch of hobbits who are small people who live in this really cozy and peaceful place, and they're given this big quest to take a powerful ring that makes the wearer invisible, but also kind of tempts them with the whispers of power, and to grab that ring and to walk it all over to Mordor, which is just evil land, and toss it into Mount Doom and destroy it. So we have all these various characters who are living in this world at the brink of war, and the forces of good and evil are both gathering and preparing themselves, and in the heart of it we have this story, this quest narrative of Frodo and Samwise and a few other hobbits who make this party alongside some humans, some elves, a dwarf, and they all get together to succeed in this quest. It sounds simple, right? It doesn't sound like a very complicated novel, and plot-wise, it really isn't. What makes this novel so complicated, much more so than just the standard quest, is the world that's built around it. And there's so many chapters where characters are either just walking in real time across these spaces that are quite historied, and so they talk a lot about what the environment is like, who used to live there, who lives there now, what they can expect there, or there are moments where characters are resting or at an inn and just talking to each other and filling each other in on the history and background of everything, or there's literally just songs and poems and all of these additional things that give the world texture but don't really push the narrative along very much. And so the reading experience of this is not so much like reading a modern fantasy novel as much as it is, honestly, my closest comparison is the Bible, because it's this mix of genres and it's this mix of history and quests and personal narratives and side stories and weird things and songs and myth and just everything, right? There's just so many things woven together, and it doesn't really feel interested in keeping the audience on the edge of their seat the entire time. Like, yes, there are very dramatic moments, and there are moments where characters do find themselves tested and prove themselves, and it can be very exciting, but it never really felt to me that that was the whole point of the novel, even though it did push the reader towards those moments, and those are the moments that probably adapt really well. I haven't seen the films. Adapted really well to the films, or are very memorable in a reader's mind. There are also lots of chapters that just like, and then they walked from here to there. This was a really hard mountain for them to climb, so they made a strategy to get over it. All of this to say that there's a kind of truthiness to this novel that I think genre readers would normally be able to forgive in a more modern fantasy novel. Like, if I was reading a modern fantasy novel and a character had to get over a mountain range and they just use a spell to do it and it takes like a paragraph, I wouldn't really mind, because I'm not here to watch them get over a mountain. I'm here to watch them have an adventure and meet characters and do what's important to that novel's plot. So for the amount of walking and waiting and getting through bits and pieces in this novel, it's not that engaging to me. And there are definitely moments where, as I was reading, I was just hoping for them to get to the next point, because I just couldn't really see what the purpose was. And it also pulls a very classic fantasy trope. Actually, I can't think of many other books that do this, but a fantasy trope where there's a big party of characters, the Fellowship, that gets formed in book one, and then for various reasons they split up and they go off and do their own little things. And The Two Towers is very well known for doing this, is having various characters having their own quests and splitting off, and then having these threads of narrative run at the same time, so that towards the end they still build tension separately, but it's not the case of we've got this one coherent narrative. It means you can explore the world more. It means that the novel covers more races and more locations and more situations, but it robs some of that kinetic force of a quest narrative that I think I probably expected going into this. This really confounded my expectations, and reading the book on its own terms, reading the book as someone who feels like they should be enjoying every moment of it, I still can't shake the tedium that is there sometimes. I think if it were distilled down into its biggest moments, then it would be a lot more potent, but as it is, it's hard for me to recommend. It's hard for me to give this to somebody and say, this is fantastic, every single word of it is valuable, because I know for a fact that it's not. So I kind of sit at a 3 out of 5 for this, especially since, unfortunately, because the fantasy genre has built so much around this, that a lot of the surprises and twists in this book just don't feel that surprising anymore. At its core, the thematics work well, the story works well, the conflict is good, the dramatic moments are done really well. It's more just the fact that it is so long dilutes some of the best parts. Like, I don't feel like anybody will love the whole of this book. They will find moments to love, they'll have characters that they love, or situations that they love, but they'll say things like, oh, I really like the Hobbit plotline, but I don't really care for the Saruman plotline, or whatever, right? Like, there's bits that you're not going to remember and you're not going to value as much going through this whole thing. I really need to talk about the thematics. So what I want to do when I make these I read this so you don't have to kind of videos is analyze the book to an extent, to talk about some of the main ideas and what I was thinking about as I was reading. And for this one, I still find it so funny that the book starts, or at least my edition does, starts with this prologue where Tolkien himself explains that this book has nothing to do with World War II. Despite the fact that it came out in the 1950s and was written largely during the period of World War II, and it was a sequel to The Hobbit, which was written before World War II, and a lot of the themes coincidentally align with things that happened in World War II, there's just this big forward that says this has nothing to do with World War II. Don't try to read allegory into this novel, because that's not what it was written for. I find that hilarious, because it's so hard to control what people think about your work, and a lot of authors today just don't even bother. They just they do what they want. And Tolkien, he seems to me like someone who really wants to control his whole world. That's why he gives so much detail, is that he doesn't want any potential misinterpretations. And he recognizes through the various things that he's designed in this book that one, for him, big misinterpretation would be to read this allegorically as some kind of story of World War II, looking at a war where two large opposing forces gather together, with one side incorporating lots of folksy cultures and starting to foster multiculturalism, as one big plot point is the allegiance between the elves and the dwarves who previously had hated each other, and the other side just being this megalomaniacal desire for power, secretly created a weapon that could destroy the whole world kind of thing. Like, that sounds like World War II, right? That sounds like a lot of things that happened in World War II. So to have that forward there, to say don't try to read it as allegory, is very, very funny to me. So when I teach reading novels in context, I often say that context works in a few different ways. Either the author can directly address their context, or the author chooses not to address their context, and by making such a bold choice, they still address their context, or they try to not address their context and fail, and there's little things that leak through the gaps. And I think this is a case of number 3, where yes, it's not written as an allegory of World War II, and they're trying really hard to not make it connect to World War II, but it's written by somebody who recently experienced what life was like in that world climate, and it's written for people who have similar experiences. So you're naturally going to find patterns that align with the Great Old World War II in this novel, and that's just something that we have to contend with. I feel like if you do take that lens, then it does show you a lot about how people were feeling around this time. That feeling of conflict being inevitable, that feeling of walking through territory and not being sure if it's safe or not, and not being sure of what the strategic value is, of looking at things like cities and mountain ranges and rivers and natural features and just going, well, what role will this play in the large conflict that's about to happen? And then having this conflict that hopefully fully resolves and then alleviates some of the stresses that are placed on the land, like, that to me is interesting. And that to me is not something that I think would ever come out of a novel that didn't get written in the mid-1900s. If we were to write fantasy today, it just wouldn't feel the same, because we don't have the same cultural memory of this big war in the same way that Tolkien would have. And in the same lens, looking at the novel's representations of race in terms of World War II and the various nationalistic forces at the time can give you something interesting. That's not what I've done, and that's not something that particularly interests me, but I do think that reading is there and very possible. Lots of people have made assertions about Tolkien's representation of orcs and how that compares to Orientalist or outsider narratives, because the orcs occupy this really interesting space of, they're not non-human, they aren't human, but they're not unsympathetic. Like, they do have language, they do have culture, they do have motivations, but they are still represented as this invading force that the characters are kind of obligated to kill. So it's there if people want to go for it. It's interesting. I just haven't done it myself. I just think that the militarism of the story is very connected to the history that it came from. And I don't think it's something that could have been helped by this author even as much as they want to avoid those connections. And I think having that forward there too suggests to me that maybe this novel is written as a form of escapism, as a kind of reclaiming of the militaristic narrative that doesn't incorporate lessons and, I guess, warnings from World War II, that stories about wars and about big political and social and national events don't have to always be about exactly what happened in the early 20th century. Maybe there's that, right? And maybe there's the whole sense that maybe we could write an enjoyable war narrative that doesn't make people feel bad, because everyone famously felt very bad after World War I and World War II. So maybe there's that. I don't know. What I do know, though, is that this novel is so war-fixated that now that it's such an influential work, I think it's just diverted fantasy to being about these militaristic conflicts. That this whole swords and sorcery, army against army, race against race type of narrative is just a lot more common. And wars and political conflicts are just the kind of go-to setting for fantasy. To the point where if I was to call something like Alice in Wonderland fantasy, it almost doesn't feel like that, because fantasy to us is now Lord of the Rings. It is now nations and races at war. I don't particularly like that. I think that, like I was saying before, narrows the scope of what we can treat as fantasy. And maybe I'm not as familiar with what fantasy looks like today, but when I do read modern fantasy and I see these patterns that now I can trace back to Lord of the Rings, it is a little bit disappointing to me, I will say. I think maybe it's also just me not finding military narratives particularly interesting. But I can't wait until that influence slowly starts to wean away. And the only other theme I want to talk about is this idea of religious themes. So earlier I compared this to the Bible, just the way that it was written. And I think an interesting theme that appears out of all of this is, well, Tolkien was a very famous Christian, and he did have a lot of influential things to say about faith in connection to his creative works. And I, on one hand, kind of read into this book is not about faith in the same way that it's not about World War II to this novel. It's not an explicitly religious novel. Like, it's not The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? Like, it's not a theological novel. But I think the themes that are present here are connected to Christianity in the same way that it's a bit connected to World War II, in that it's something that was such a large part of Tolkien's life that it can't help but be there in some way. And two things I find really interesting with the religious side of things. Number one is just this character of Gandalf, who is very powerful and kind of unquestionably good. He's the one person that has the plan for everything, and he's able to recognize that he himself can't resist the temptation of the ring. He wants to stay good, and so he entrusts the hobbits with the ring, because this is this big grand gambit power plan to avoid the corrupting force, which is exactly what the Dark Lord wants. Gandalf as a character is interesting because he's so powerful and yet he's fallible, or at least he is away for quite large periods of the text. And the core conflict is the other characters needing to trust Gandalf when he's not there, and to trust Gandalf that his plan will work even when there's no logical evidence to suggest that it might. When characters decide that, hey, maybe we don't want to do what Gandalf does, instead maybe we want to use the ring for ourselves, that's the kind of most dangerous point in the novel. And to me that kind of aligns with this feeling of Christianity today, where there's the impetus to trust the Bible and to trust God, and even in the moments where it's not immediately apparent where God is or what God is doing, that's the most crucial to be able to continue to trust God. I wonder if those questions of faith and doubt are working their way into this book, because to me that's one of the most apparent conflicts here, is not just a conflict between good and evil, but a conflict between good and wavering faith, where characters who are described as good fall away because they don't trust in any higher power being Gandalf here, and instead think that they can take matters into their own hands. And many people are just not suited to wield the power of the ring. power is corrupting and power is dangerous, and either there is a plan to abdicate that power and to destroy it, or the person who tries to wield it, even for good purposes, run an enormous risk of temptation and corruption from that. And I don't know what practically can be gained from this, other than I can kind of mirror these stories together, and it does help me understand and appreciate this book a little bit more to see this theme at play. I still can't think of too many other fantasy narratives that play with this kind of trope, because having a character as overpowered as Gandalf kind of does kill the stakes a little bit, and this is not a high stakes book for that exact fact. That, yeah, there's just not much to say other than Gandalf's pretty cool. The only other comparison I can make, this is so silly for me to say, but it's kind of like Goku in Dragon Ball Z, where we have this character who's super duper powerful, but not always there, and so the other characters have to let go of their arrogance and thinking that they can fix it themselves and just wait for Goku. Is that meaningful? I don't know. I've gone on a tangent. But the other theme that to me connects with religion is this more binary good and evil narrative. So there is evil in this text, and that evil is unquestionably so. We don't really meet them very much, and we don't know their motivations much as well. The evil is inhuman. The evil is headless riders and demons with wings and this dark lord whose motivations we don't know aside from amassing the maximum amount of power. And so having an evil that's this, I guess, simplistic, to me also leads to the sense of religiosity, where it's a battle between good and evil, and unquestionable good and evil, and it presents this world in this binary lens. So this novel is a little bit before postmodernism, I would say, and it's a little bit before moral relativism became much more prevalent in terms of narrative structures. I think that there's lots of fantasy novels afterwards that have things like villains with just motivations, or heroes who are more susceptible to corruption, or just shades of grey. For better or for worse, I feel like the grimdark of the latter periods has its own problems, but it does create a barrier for modern readers to get into this. Is that, can you take a narrative that's just binary good and binary evil and big good and big evil on its face value? And if you can, that's fine. And if you're someone who wants to question those assumptions behind it, then this book, to me, doesn't give that many satisfying answers. It is quite simple in that sense. So that's The Lord of the Rings. It's big, long, detailed, influential fantasy with various races coming together to fight this big evil, and good is good, and bad is bad, and Gandalf is powerful, and unfortunately, it's a lot more humorless than The Hobbit, which I enjoyed a lot more. The Hobbit I gave a 4 out of 5. It was really fun. This I give a 3 out of 5. It's... The negative things I can say about it is that it's overly detailed and slow, and at times a little bit self-indulgent. It wants to make this enormous universe that the reader wants to occupy, but it sacrifices the engagement of a story for that purpose. And I can imagine the Silmarillion is just this to a higher extent. So even less framing narrative and even more detailed to a world that is completely fantastical. It's one of the things that I personally don't like about fantasy, is that after I put the book down, I have to really rack my brain and think, well, what relevance does this have to the real world now that I'm back in the real world? I'm not someone who really reads for escapism. I'm more of a critic. And as a critic, it's hard to ignore the flaws of this book. It's definitely not perfect. I'm very thankful that I did read it. I do feel like I learned a lot about lots of different things, and also just genre traditions in fantasy. But, I'm not moved. I'm not swayed. My will hasn't been turned upside down. Okay, so let's do it. We've done Lord of the Rings, so let's find another difficult book to read this year. I'm only including things that I currently own on my shelf right now, because I can't really be bothered to buy more. So, well, at least not until I finish some of these. So let's see what we have. No. Oh no. It's not time for this. So I did finish reading Dubliners this month, and I do understand that book. I haven't even read the Odyssey. I did think to myself, if I want to read Ulysses, I have to read the Odyssey, and if I want to read the Odyssey, I need to read the Iliad. And I bought a copy of the Iliad, and it is in Shakespearean English because I don't understand how translations work. But is it time for Ulysses? Let's read the first page of Ulysses. Let's see how I feel. So my edition is the Wordsworth Classics one, where the font size is very small, and the glossary is at the very back, so in the least useful of places. And look, it doesn't actually have any explanations for this one. I don't know how I feel. I don't know how I feel about this. Let me try and read the first page and see what I think. Okay. Let's see how many pages it is. 682 pages. I can see towards the end that grammar and punctuation start to fade away, so that'll be fun. Okay. Stately, plump buck mulligan came from the stairhead. You know, it's not impossible. I'm a few pages in. I'm not understanding nothing. I am surprised at how much random Latin is thrown around sometimes, but I'm cautiously optimistic. I think maybe I can do it. So in future months, we'll do Ulysses updates, and we'll see how we go. I'm not looking forward to reading this on the train or in public. I'm just going to feel so pretentious. But we're going to get through it. We're going to get through Ulysses, hopefully by the end of 2024. Okay, goodbye.